But get hold of Tropic of Cancer, get hold of Black Spring, and read especially the first 100 pages. They give you an idea of what can still be done, even at this late date, with English prose. In them, English is treated as a spoken language, but spoken without fear, i.e., without fear of rhetoric or of the unusual or poetic word. The adjective has come back after 10 years' exile. It is a flowing, swelling prose, a prose with rhythms in it, something quite different from the flat, cautious statements and snack bar dialects that are now in fashion. Welcome to Positive Read-Ins. That was an excerpt from George Orwell's 1940 essay, Inside the Whale. This is a long essay divided in 3 parts. The first part and the last part are looking at the work of Henry Miller. It's an appraisal of his work. It's a praise of Henry Miller's work, but not just praise. It's qualified. He does have some criticisms as well. And the second section, connecting to the first and the third, is a survey of English prose, mainly from the 1920s and 30s, a little bit pre that date, 1917. So in this first section, he introduces Miller, Henry Miller, specifically the Tropic of Cancer. He hadn't read the Tropic of Capricorn at this point, partly because, as he mentions, he can't get it. It's you're not allowed to sell it at the time. It was banned. So partly this is a criticism of that censorship. What does he say about Miller? First part that I think is interesting as just anyone who's going to read Henry Miller and try to understand Miller, or even anyone who's going to read other writers who are writing about a foreign culture, he talks about exile and how that affects the writer. So he says here, exile is probably more damaging to a novelist than to a painter, or even a poet, because its effect is to take him out of contact with working life and narrow down his range to the street, the cafe, the church, the brothel, and the studio. On the whole, in Miller's books, you are reading about people living the expatriate life, people drinking, talking, meditating, and fornicating, not about people working, marrying, and bringing up children. A pity, because he would have described the one set of activities as well as the other. So you can see this is kind of an even-handed criticism. In part, he's criticizing the fact that Miller's writing from this expat perspective, which implied here is that this narrows what the writer can write about. Also implied here is that Orwell believes the things that writers should be writing about, it seems to be, is people working, marrying, and bringing up their children. So that kind of the real work of a culture, of a society. But Miller is really just writing about kind of the expat, the one who's disconnected, who is kind of playing and behaving badly in a lot of ways. And so he sees this as a negative. I see this as also an interesting way of considering how where you are in a society and your relationship to society as a writer, how that can affect the topics you write about and the style that you write in. Orwell then talks about how Henry Miller is usually compared to James Joyce, specifically Ulysses, and also Celine's Journey to the End of the Night. Orwell rejects both of these. He sees James Joyce as being the better artist. He does mention here that their one point of commonality with Joyce is a willingness to mention the inane, squalid facts of everyday life. But beyond that, he's saying they're doing very different things. In comparison to Celine, which might seem like it has more of a tonal connection, he says here that Journey to the End of the Night is a book with a purpose, and its purpose is to protest against the horror and the meaninglessness of modern life, actually, indeed, of life. It is a cry of unbearable disgust, a voice from the cesspool. Tropic of Cancer is almost exactly the opposite. And I think people might confuse that because there is so much cesspool going on in Tropic of Cancer, but this is the difference. The thing has become so unusual as to seem almost anomalous, but it is the book of a man who is happy. So this is the unusual thing, is that Tropic of Cancer, yes, you have this man kind of living in filth, getting lice, basically living out of a brothel most of the time, but he's happy. It's not a protest against this. It's someone who has accepted this world as it is. And this is what he goes on to talk about after, and how this is kind of a morally tricky position to take, because as he says here, to accept in our age means that you are accepting concentration camps, rubber truncheons, Hitler, Stalin, bombs, and he goes on to name a bunch of other kind of modern machinery, some good, some mostly bad. That's part of the things that we need to accept in this society. And he's saying that, yeah, this is kind of a strange place to be in if you're just accepting this morally. It's a strange place to be in. Rounding out this section and also his description of Miller, he mentions how Miller used to be an editor for this paper called The Booster, and the description of that paper, that magazine, is actually a really fit-in description of Miller's style, and I think it's worth reading. He says here that description is non-political, non-educational, non-progressive, non-cooperative, non-ethical, non-literary, non-consistent, non-contemporary. And that is Miller's work, a lot of nons. In the second section of this essay, Orwell takes more of an academic look at kind of a survey of literature, though he's constantly bringing in his own personal connections as well. He talks about when he was 17, how he memorized almost all of A Shropshire Lad by Housman, and Housman's popularity. This is, I think, just after World War I. And he was satisfyingly anti-Christian. He stood for a kind of bitter, defiant paganism, a conviction that life is short and the gods are against you, which exactly fitted the prevailing mood of the young. And all in charming, fragile verse that was composed almost entirely of words of one syllable. So you can see, I think it's a nice description of Housman's work, but it also shows kind of the deceptively rebellious tone of Housman's work. And then later, just on the next page, he says, but at bottom, it is always a writer's tendency, his purpose, his message, that makes him liked or disliked. The proof of this is the extreme difficulty of seeing any literary merit in a book that seriously damages your deepest beliefs. And no book is ever truly neutral. Some tendency or other is always discernible in verse as much as in prose, even if it does no more than determine the form and the choice of imagery. So again, I think that's another important point to bring up. We have all this kind of speculation about what makes a good writer good, and Orwell saying at bottom, it's the tendency, the purpose, the message, kind of their outlook, their perspective of life, and that is kind of inherent in that work. That brings him to look at the general perspective of a group of writers he calls I think it's the Joyce Eliot group, but basically this is James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, D.H. Lawrence, Huxley's in there, E.M. Forster a bit. So these are all writers who were working in the 1920s, and things that he says they all have in common is kind of this conservative, anti-progress perspective. He says here, all of them are temperamentally hostile to the notion of progress. It is felt that progress not only doesn't happen, but ought not to happen. Eliot's pessimism is partly the Christian pessimism, which implies a certain indifference to human misery, partly a lament over the decadence of Western civilization. Later, talking about D.H. Lawrence, he says, but what he is demanding is a movement away from our mechanized civilization, which is not going to happen, and which he knows is not going to happen. Therefore, his exasperation with the present turns once more into idealization of the past. So all of these writers, according to Orwell, are conservative in the sense that they're idolizing the past, they're rejecting the present, they're rejecting modernization. I think this is a big theme in modernism as well, to kind of reject the urbanization and the increasingly mechanized society. And this is what you get from these 1920s authors. Relatedly, Orwell looks at how political doctrine plays a part in this. He says, the best writers of the 20s did not subscribe to this doctrine. Their purpose is, in most cases, fairly overt, but it is usually a purpose along moral, religious, cultural lines. Also, when translatable into political terms, it is in no case left. In one way or another, the tendency of all the writers in this group is conservative, as I mentioned before. But he's talking about how this is fallen right on the heels of World War I. And so there is a rise in left, but a lot of these writers were not going along with that. That came in the next generation in the 1930s. That next group, that more progressive group of the 1930s, Orwell is not, even though I feel like they identify more with his political orientation, but he's certainly not, he doesn't speak of them kindly. He says here, but why did these young men turn towards anything so alien as Russian communism? Why should writers be attracted by a form of socialism that makes mental honesty impossible? The explanation really lies in something that had already made itself felt before the slump and before Hitler: middle-class unemployment. By the 1930s, the system really isn't working for a lot of these writers, and that would be, I think, natural for them to push towards a more progressive system that would bring that. That would be the left system. But as we're seeing here, they're coming out of this, fairly, I don't want to use the word privilege, but a better lifestyle than, say, or an easier lifestyle than the writers who came before them. So one of the writers that he looks at here is W.H. Auden. I'm not going to read the poem, but in the poem he mentions this necessary murder, and that's the phrase that Auden uses. And Orwell says, but notice the phrase necessary murder. It could only be written by a person to whom murder is at most a word. Personally, I would not speak so lightly of murder. It so happens that I have seen the bodies of numbers of murdered men. I don't mean killed in battle, I mean murdered. Therefore, I have some conception what murder means: the terror, the hatred, the howl in relatives, the postmortems, the blood, the smells. Mr. Auden's brand of amoralism is only possible if you are the kind of person who is always somewhere else when the trigger is pulled. So there's a criticism of these writers from the 1930s who are more progressive, more leftists, but they also don't have the experience, according to Orwell, that the earlier writers had. this tendency to move left, along with kind of the rise of anti-fascism, which again I think Orwell would fully support, but he said this changed the write-in. So the write-in, he said, left-wing thought had narrowed down to anti-fascism, i.e. to a negative. So it's just against this thing. And kind of summarizing the problem that this brought about, he says, on the whole, the literary history of the 30s seems to justify the opinion that a writer does well to keep out of politics. For any writer who accepts or partially accepts the discipline of a political party is sooner or later faced with the alternative: toe the line or shut up. And then a little later on, literature as we know it is an individual thing, demanding mental honesty and a minimum of censorship. So he sees this political writing as you're kind of brought into this party, you're brought into the orthodoxy of that party, that stifles the writer, and eventually you either have to toe the line or you are censored or you're out. Whereas the writer needs to be free to reject orthodoxy. Later on, he says this: the atmosphere of orthodoxy is always damaging to prose, and above all, it is completely ruinous to the novel, the most anarchical of all forms of literature. How many Roman Catholics have been good novelists? Even the handful one could name have usually been bad Catholics. The novel is practically a Protestant form of art. It is a product of the free mind of the autonomous individual. So, this has a lot of implications for our time, where a lot of the popular writers, bestsellers, writers getting pushed as, kind of the big literary writers nowadays, I would say are probably writing from the orthodoxy. They very similar political views, similar political opinions, and not the free thinkers that Orwell's demanding that they must be. Also, he says here at the end of this section 2, good novels are not written by orthodoxy sniffers, nor by people who are conscience-stricken about their own unorthodoxy. So orthodoxy, people who are, orthodox and kind of following along with that very closely, but also the ones who are kind of overly conscious that they are unorthodox. Both are damaging to good prose. Good novels are written by people who are not frightened. This brings me back to Henry Miller. And this is a segue into the last section where he looks at Miller's work. Again, Orwell more than implies that he doesn't agree with Miller's political views and this kind of, policy of just accepting the way things are. They actually, Orwell and Miller met briefly in Paris. This is talked about in here while Orwell was on his way to Spain to fight in the Civil War. Miller thought he was crazy to be doing that. Why go put your life on the line for this? The perspective that Miller seems to have, according to Orwell, is that, the world is going to change, it's going down, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm just going to kind of accept how things are going. So taking that idea of a certain political outlook or certain ideas that you have about the world and how that finds its way into your work, this is what Orwell has to say. Much of the literature that comes to us out of the past is permeated by and in fact founded on beliefs. The belief in the immortality of the soul, for example, which now seems to us false and in some cases contemptibly silly. Yet it is good literature, if survival is any test. So even though it's permeated with these ideas that seem silly to us, these works still survive. They're considered good works of literature. Well, why is that? Again, later on, next page, he says, it seems, therefore, that for a creative writer, possession of the truth is less important than emotional sincerity. So emotional sincerity is what we need, not necessarily the truth. And again, you can think back to the Auden quote. Auden was not being sincere when he was describing death, according to Orwell, because he hadn't actually seen murder, so he can write about it in an insincere way. Again, this is something I think we can see in a lot of contemporary literature today. Orwell is pessimistic about the future of writing. He thinks, again, this is in 1940, he says that because it's generally imagined that socialism could preserve and even enlarge the atmosphere of liberalism, it is now beginning to be realized how false this idea was. He thinks we're moving towards dictatorships. He goes on to say, but from now onwards, the all-important fact for the creative writer is going to be that this is not a writer's world. And that's probably even more true today. This is not a writer's world. That does not mean that he cannot help to bring the new society into being, but he can take no part in the process as a writer. For as a writer, he is a liberal. And what is happening is the destruction of liberalism. And I think that's a wise point. So even these conservative writers, as writers, they are liberal. And I think that's where you get this contradiction in a lot of these writers' works. Take Knut Hamsun, politically very conservative, but clearly his perspective in his novels and his work are also very much liberal and open. But as he says here, what is happening in this world, and again, I think it's happening in our world as well, is the destruction of liberalism. And how does Miller react to this? He's saying, progress and reaction have both turned out to be swindles. Right? Progress isn't going to help us, neither is reacting to it, protesting. Seemingly, there is nothing left but quietism, robbing reality of its terrors by simply submitting to it. So again, you can hear in the tone, Orwell does not champion this view, but he does think that the honesty in which Miller does, or Miller takes it, the fact that Miller's not trying to preach to others to also do this, he respects Miller for that. He does say, however, that he thinks Miller is probably what he calls a one-book man. I don't think that has turned out to be the case. At this time, he's writing 1940. He hadn't read the Colossus of Marushi, which I think is maybe one of Miller's best. But that's the assessment Orwell's given. And then finally he says here, because he's saying that Miller's an important writer. As a rule, novels are spoken of as important when they are either a terrible indictment of something or other, or when they introduce some technical innovation. Neither of these applies to Tropic of Cancer. Its importance is merely symptomatic. Here, in my opinion, is the only imaginative prose writer of the slightest value who has appeared among the English-speaking races for some years past. Even if that is objected to as an overstatement, it will probably be admitted that Miller is a writer out of the ordinary, worth more than a single glance. And after all, he is completely negative, unconstructive, amoral writer, a mere Jonah, a passive acceptor of evil, a sort of Whitman among the corpses. And he describes earlier how Miller's perspective is very much a Whitman, a celebration of life in its beauty and its ugliness. So that is Inside the Whale by Orwell. It's a fascinating essay. It's a bit long compared to some of his other essays, but well worth looking at, not just for fans of Henry Miller, but also for an understanding of literature and how it was developing in the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s. Thank you for listening.